Very good. I see the
There we go.
recording on. Cool.
All set.
Thanks,
Yep.
Brent. Appreciate it. All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started here. I'm sure some folks will roll in, except for those who are about ready to turn on the first NFL game of the season, so we might be short a few here this evening. Welcome, everybody. Thanks again for joining me. This is our ninth Tech Talk. My name is Jim White. I serve on the EdgeX steering committee, as well as the chair of the core working group. What we're going to be talking about here today in this talk is about the logging microservice. In particular, as you'll note in our microservice architecture, we have tried to provide a set of facilities that are not always or only about the collection of data from sensors and devices and the actuation back down to those sensor devices, but we've also tried to facilitate what I would call, or I have typically called in a lot of my presentations, the ash and trash of almost any computing system. Logging being just one of those, and no hurtful feelings, I hope, to anybody who does logging for a living, but it is one of those things that just every application has to do. And we tried to facilitate in that EdgeX allows for this kind of centralized service so that it doesn't have to be duplicated in every single microservice or in all the componentry or applications that go on top of EdgeX out there. So we'll talk a bit about it, talk about the technology we use to create the current and existing logging service, talk about some options that are available there and how to configure it and how it works. We'll look at how you add logging to your particular microservice, or in particular, how it's added to the existing set of microservices out there that are part of EdgeX. Both in terms of what you need in configuration, but then also what the actual object structure is. And if you want to get into its guts and start to figure out how it works and tear it apart and redevelop it, you'll have an opportunity to do so. We will talk about the REST API with a little bit of a demo, see how this particular microservice works, particularly in how you add entries, but then also how you go about querying the logs. In particular, if you want to be a user of the log service, not from a dropping entries, but maybe you've got a security service you're building, and something that shows up in a log might trigger some sort of security alert. We'll see how to do that with the queries that it provides. We'll talk about upcoming tech talks, and as always, leave it available at the end for any questions you have, not only about the logging service, but about EdgeX in general. No topic off limits. So in the big picture of things from an EdgeX perspective, again, we're talking about the logging service, one of those services that is often referred to as one of the supporting services. Today, the way we manage the application that is EdgeX, we usually talk about south side things. That's what's down here at the device service level. We talk about north side things, which is our export services, and typically also includes things like our rules engine. And then we've got the core and supporting services. That's the group that I chair, but also kind of lumped together because we usually typically see both that which is relevant to collection of data and actuation of commands back down, as well as kind of just keeping the application up and running is all part of that core and supporting service area. So what is logging microservices' role in EdgeX? Provides centralized management of these capabilities, that is the logging of anything that any service or maybe even some other application that's working with EdgeX may want to make. Offering long-term persistence of that information. We do have, as we'll talk about, a couple of options about how the log entries are persisted, but also offering ability with that persistence to be able to go back and do your query, your analysis, bug diagnoses, whatever the case may be. With some sort of logging system that may just kind of drop in a line in some sort of file. If that file circulates, that creates a bit of a problem in that it may be only temporary. So EdgeX offers some longer term persistence. How long term you need is dependent on your particular use case. Consolidates the participating microservices in terms of the events and the level of detail they provide, at least to some extent. We can't dictate exactly how you put text in your log entry, but we can help to dictate a little bit about how those entries are uniform in terms of the other information around them and some of the specifics about the levels and such that are consolidated in this service. We define an API that allows for the logging service to be well-defined and thereby improved, updated, modified in the future. Maybe you need a logging service that does even more than what ours does today. Again, mentioning things like providing for security audits or pushing logs to remote servers, things of that nature. All are capabilities that could be value add in the future. And the API, as with any of our EdgeX microservices, helps to clearly delineate and define what this service does so that it can be filled in by other capabilities going forward. At a high level, there are some particulars about the service. Yep, it provides a REST API, as all of our services do right now, for both requesting log entries, but also doing queries on those log entries. And it does so in what we call a non-blocking manner. We've built the logging service so that it should not take up the thread that maybe is processing the data with regard to your sensor information coming up through EdgeX or actuation back down. The log entries also have to be associated to a particular originating service, and this helps to facilitate our search and query capability. Supports multiple levels, as you would expect in any logging system. Pretty standard nowadays: trace, debug, info, warn, error, those kinds of things. It supports tagging, so if you need to label a particular log entry in a certain way, that helps to collect them and again offer better query capability. Even across microservices, that's supported. Persists log entry in either the database, in particular MongoDB, which we'll talk about, or it does allow for file system if you maybe need something a little bit lighter weight, or you don't want Mongo involved or some other database involved when you do want to manage these entries. It takes advantage of an existing logging framework. We felt no need in the Dell community, where we built this initial microservice, to have to replicate or reinvent the wheel with regard to logging. So it essentially is a wrapper around an existing log service, and we'll talk about that, which also means that since this logging service is open source, we can depend on other groups to help kind of maintain some of its capability, at least this reference implementation. We follow an applicable standard with regard to logging where possible, meaning, again, we're trying to kind of make for some conformity here so that each microservice's log entries, the log data, the information about how to access the logs, things of that nature, become more consistent over time. And the fact that we're using a standard framework, again, that uses standards out there, is also a boost in that, again, we are trying to allow for upgrades, new capabilities going forward, ones that follow standards in the logging world. And most importantly, maybe to some of you who are developers, we're really trying to handle the mundane activity here. Does anybody really want to build another logging service? You know, those kind of things are I don't want to say dimes a dozen nowadays, but there are quite a few of them out there, and having to reinvent the wheel for any new microservice just seemed to be kind of a waste of time and a waste of effort in our very resource intensive environment. So helping that for all developers. Use of our logging service is optional. What do I mean by that? The microservices that we have connected up to EdgeX can choose, and in some cases may choose, to not be sending things to the central logging service. In fact, we've actually configured it such that in development worlds, or in your development environment, for example, if you bring up any one of our microservices in Eclipse, the logging service is not used by default. And the idea there is pretty simple. You can get away in development of just writing things out to a log file, and we do so in such a way that is non-intrusive to you, the developer. It's a simple change of enabling or disabling in the configuration of the logging service to turn it on. And in a development world where you just need to be able to go out and check a file for a log entry you've made, that tends to be a little bit more convenient than maybe having to dig into a database. But in production, where you need to have global and more systemic query capability into a centralized logging system across microservices, it's on by default. So it's a simple matter of configuration. And we'll talk more about that as we present the logging service here going forward. So some implementation details. This is another Java Spring Framework Spring Boot application using Spring MVC to provide for the REST communications. Pretty typical of the work we did at Dell. Again, trying to get to some quick and available services without having to build lots of infrastructure and framework. We just took advantage of one that was already there. Internally, as I mentioned, we are applying and using an open source product. We are simply wrapping it with this service. So in particular, we use what is called the Logback framework, which is at least based on their website and by all community accounts, sort of a successor to the popular Log4j, if you're familiar with Log4j in the Java community. So in essence, as you will see, if you look into the code, really this microservice is nothing more than a REST API and some standards and some bits of code wrapped around the logback mechanism. The website out there too gives you a lot more details if you want to get into it, into Logback. They've got a pretty good website, as did Log4j. That gives you all the details about their API, how to use it, how you can replace different log implementations underneath. A lot more details there if you want to get into it. Hopefully this service has helped to obfuscate that, meaning you do not have to get into those details unless you really want to. With our logging implementation, log entries can be persisted, as I mentioned, in two options, either via MongoDB or via the file system logs. Again, file system logs we primarily use for development, but MongoDB we are recommending for things like production. And in particular with the file system logs, there is a bit of an issue with regard to file system. We also have to kind of cache the entries into the logs or made by log entries to be able to do some querying when we're using file system. And that cache can grow quite large quite quickly depending on how much logging you do. And that does bring into the picture some performance concerns, some resource concerns. And so we're really suggesting to use that only for development purposes. Allow Mongo with its much richer caching engines and indexes, allow that to be kind of your primary central logging facility of choice underneath the covers when you're in some sort of production type mode. Clients who want to either send log entries in or query log entries, they can be set up to either use the REST APIs directly. In other words, as we'll take a look, there is a very well defined set of APIs which allows you to add new messages into the logs or to query for logs based on all sorts of different parameters. Or if you're using Java, we did build a Java client library, and you can incorporate that into your Java project, a simple POM pull, and you have a client library that very quickly, very easily allows you to use this logging capability. We'll actually show you both these options going forward here as well. In fact, unless you're intending to replace the logging service, primarily these will be the two ways that you will interact and use the logging service. Probably not a lot of reasons to get into the details of things like Logback or under the covers into the logging service unless you intend to replace it. At a high level, here's the architecture. Many services might be out there. Some of those services might be out requesting log entries. They may be making log entries. They may be doing cleaning up and pruning of the messages that are in the service. Again, that can all be done via REST API. Even when you're using the Java libraries underneath the covers, they're using the REST API in many cases. At the center is Logback. We are just wrapping that particular capability with our Spring Boot Spring MVC application. Yes, this is another one of the microservices that does allow for its configuration to be obtained from console, as every one of our services does. And underneath the covers, as I mentioned, you got MongoDB or log files as a mechanism to store and retrieve those log entries. The application side or client side has no need to know or even care about what the actual underlying implementation is. They're doing all their work through the Logback service, this wrapper and capability around Logback. So the details are hidden from any clients out there. At kind of a object level, API level, underneath the covers, as I mentioned, this is a Spring MVC application. So you will find for the REST API, there's an MVC controller out there that provides that REST interface. So if you have a client microservice, your client is going to be talking to that MVC controller. That controller is auto-wired into a logging service impl, if you will, kind of the front point, the wrapper around the capabilities within inside of the logging service. And then there is a DAO that logging service is also wired to. We've got a base DAO, and it's either a file or a Mongo implementation, which is configured and brought up at the start of the service that the logging service actually uses to actually persist and then go and retrieve your data, your log entries. So it's actually a fairly thin, pretty simple architecture, as you can see. If you're familiar with the MVC pattern, it follows that pretty astutely. And Logback is really used inside of that service there to be able to deal with just the normal APIs like you would in a Log4j circumstance of getting, adding, searching for various log entries. One thing to note, there are some enumerations out there. In particular, you'll note that there's a enum out there for the various levels, and so we try to stick to the standard levels you'd find in most logging systems today. So that's kind of how the architecture works underneath the covers. When you start up the microservice, when you start up the logging microservice, there are some key configuration elements that are going to dictate how it works under the covers. So this is where you may want to, as even a user of the logging microservice, go in and make some changes to be able to facilitate your particular use case needs. In particular, the all-important one is the logging persistence mechanism. Again, by default, we set this up in development world to be file. You will see that in the more production settings, for example, if you look at the Docker configuration of our microservice, it's set up to be MongoDB. So your choice or the selection you leave here is going to determine what particular persistent mechanism underneath the covers the logging services use. Based on your selection of the logging persistence, you may need to then adjust or maybe at least think about some of the other configuration property settings. If you're going by file, that is persistence by file, you're going to want to actually set the file location of where you want that logging service to go. And this one is a little bit more difficult to set up by default because when you deal with things like Windows versus Linux systems, things can get to be a bit cantankerous there. In our development worlds, we've got it set up by default to drop the log file right into your project area. In a production setting, we've got it set up going to an EdgeX volume for Docker, for example. So pick your path here about where you want that file to be created. You also want to set up the maximum size you want that file to be. Obviously, this is where some of those resource constraints that I mentioned have to be considered when you're thinking about file-based mechanism there. If you're using MongoDB as your persistence choice, typical case where you need to configure how to access Mongo database and how to point the logging service to that instance. You might know too that the actual collection being used is called logging inside of Mongo, and that is actually initialized as part of our initialization script for our MongoDB instance. So you don't have to do anything special when logging service comes up to allow it to use Mongo. You just have to point it to it as its logging persistence mechanism. Now, if you're going to be using the logging service, as I mentioned, there are two choices here. Use the REST APIs directly, and you could do that from any kind of programming world, obviously, as long as it has the ability to make a REST call. Or if you're using Java, you can still use the REST APIs, but you may choose, as you'll see here very quickly, to use the logging client. There are some convenience classes and methods in there that make dropping in this particular service very, very quick, easy, and slick. And in fact, the API here mimics that of Log4j or Logback, so that if you are using for maybe some development purposes, maybe you're using Log4j or SFL4j in your development and coding, and then you realize, oh, I want to use that microservice, you'll see that really it's just a line or two of code change to get that to work. So let's take a look at these two options. First of all, in terms of the REST API, which you can use from any application client, we have APIs in there that are well-defined. There's a RAML out there, a RAML document out there that defines this API that I'm about to show you. But some basics here are pretty straightforward. We have the ability to make a new log entry, and you simply do a post to the API v1 logs address. JSON code is put in the body to specify your log entry, what your log level is, what the original service is. In this case, I'm showing an example of where core data is making a deposit of a log entry. What your text message is, what is your actual log entry, and then again, you're allowed to put in any labels you want. And these are strings, as you see. So we are leaving it up to the developer to essentially establish their labels in a standardized fashion. We don't really care what they are. They're just that, just strings, just labels. We allow you to kind of figure out what you want to be as your kind of custom tags maybe for your application. But they are searchable, as we'll see, by the API set. If you want to get back all of the log entries, simply make a call to that same API set. You will note, however, we do require you to set a number, which is the number of entries you want returned, what we call the limit. And there are some hard and fast limits just to protect the service from having to be killed by you making a request for every log entry over the last 22 years. We do have some hard and fast and max limits that are defined by configuration so that a user couldn't request more than what seems to be reasonable. And we let you define in configuration determine what that reasonable number is. So the log entry max here is determined by that configuration. The number the user provides just tells us how many log entries they want to get back. And there are many queries beyond this simple get. And there are actually delete operations that mimic the query capability. So what you'll find is you can either query or delete log entries by all sorts of various parameter options, by time frame, by labels, originating service, keywords that again are what are elements in the text of your message, if you will, log levels, and then any combination or many combinations of the above. So as an example here, I show one where we're making a request of the logging service to give us back all log entries, or I should say give us back the 10 latest log entries that have keywords of rocks and between 0, which is the beginning of time, and this particular timestamp. So let's take a look, just a little bit of a demo here. Let's take a look at the logging service API, see it in action, give yourself some assurances that it is going to work as you expect it to. So I've got in my environment right now, I have the logging service up and running as a microservice right now, actually running on my local host. So as I mentioned, we can make a post to the API v1 logs address at the 48061 port number. That's the standard port, which is configurable for the logging service. We're going to post in some JSON. So I set the content type to application JSON. And then again, the JSON code in the body is what actually provides your entry. Set your log level. In this case, I'm setting it to info. Original service, what is the originating service? We're going to assume at this point that's core data making this report. We'll provide a message here. Let's change that just so we have a little excitement here. So we'll say EdgeX rocks, and greeting and hello as our labels. Simply send that in, and I get back the ID of that particular log entry. To then go and see all of the log entries, just call API v1 logs. But again, remember there is a limit, so you are going to have to place a number at the end of that API call on the get call. I'll ask for the last, say, 20 entries at this point. And you can see I get back a list of what is in there currently in the system. Now that's a generic get call for a large collection of the entries. I can also ask for things a little bit more specifically. In this particular example, I'm going to ask for, give me the log entries where the keywords, in other words, where some of the text in the message includes the word rocks. And again, from the beginning of time till the end of time, and I'll ask for the last 10 entries. And if I send that in, I see what comes back is the EdgeX rocks query that, or I should say log entry that I just made a couple of seconds ago. So again, REST API is one means by which applications can go in there and both add entries to the log, but also query back the log. So you might be using both. You might be using only one set of those APIs, really up to you and your particular microservice. Okay, so that's the log API mechanism of doing work with our logging service. So I mentioned the other option here is that you can use the support logging client Java jar file. We've got a separate repo out there in EdgeX. It's actually called support logging client. You'll need to add a POM entry. And you can see any one of our microservices today is using this library. So you can check the POM XML file for any one of our services, say core data, microdata, our metadata, whichever service you want to take as your example. And you'll see a POM entry in there for the support logging client. That is what's going to bring this particular capability then into your application. Then you will need to use the API with just a couple of lines of code in whichever class you want to actually make some log entries. First of all, you'll need a static member in a class that's going to make a log entry, and this is what sets up the logger. For those of you who are familiar with log4j or SFL for J, this is going to look very, very familiar, and there's a reason for that. We've based it again on Logback, which is a descendant of log4j, and so on and so forth. So you'll see the API looks very, very similar. We have what's called an EdgeX logger. This instance has to get set up by making a call to a EdgeX logger factory to create that particular logger instance. You'll want to deposit the name of your class in here so that it gives it some context. Once you've got that instance set up, then to make log entries, simply call that particular logger with your level of log entry, error, warning, info, whatever the case might be, and put your text or message in place there. One thing I should mention, I think it was a warning I had on one of my previous slides too. If you do a logger to trace, if you're making a trace log entry, realize that we've made some decisions in EdgeX to say we do not want those particular types of message to be persisted. So if they're going to MongoDB, they're not being persisted. And that was on purpose. You can obviously make some changes to the code if you feel that that should be persisted. But the reason for that obviously is we felt those are really pertinent to developers and not meant for production type settings. And so if you make a logger trace, that's not going to go to the Mongo database. Once you've got the static variable in place, once you make your log entries, do know that there are configuration settings in your application that you'll need to make to essentially turn this logging feature on, point it to the actual logging service, and also by default provide a name for the origin service for any log entries. So enable is the key one. Set this to false and it turns off the logging to the central logging service. Provide the URL to where that logging service is located. And again, this name, this application name, is what determines the default name for all the origin services. You can also provide the origin service in your call explicitly, as you saw via the REST calls. Okay, folks, that kind of wraps up our talk on logging service today. As you can see, a pretty simple little service, and one that can hopefully remove some of the mundane features that you typically have to do with any application and allows for a lot of other capability as well going forward. Take your questions here in just a second, but I do want to kind of outline a couple things with regard to Tech Talks here. We are going to have a Tech Talk next week, which I'm sure will be a pretty popular one. Tyler Cox, our super genius in residence at Dell, is going to be giving next week's Tech Talk, and he's going to be looking at the device service SDK, and in particular show you how to actually create a new device service with that SDK. The SDK is still going under some rework. We're still kind of hashing out some of the things in the API, so that Tech Talk will only be as good as any updates we make, but we're going to try to preserve the API and preserve the structure of that as much as possible going forward. But there may be some small changes, and Tyler will kind of outline for you some of the changes we're thinking about with regard to that service. But if you're into connecting Southside things to EdgeX, you'll want to, in particular, attend that Tech Talk next week. That'll be at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Apologies to folks who are on the West Coast. I know that'll be bright and early, but as always, these are recorded, so you can get up later and take a look at the recording. We are then going to suspend the Tech Talks for a few weeks because we have the Barcelona release coming up in the first part of October, and most of us are very, very busy trying to lock that down and get things set up for that. So we're going to focus on the Barcelona release, and then we'll pick back up the Tech Talks post Barcelona. We'll make announcements on that and make sure everybody has gotten sufficient warning about when they are resuming and what the topics will be. And as far as that's concerned, we're looking for your suggestions. If you have ideas about what the Tech Talks should be about, in particular post Barcelona, we would be very much welcoming of your opinions and suggestions. Please feel free to send me an email. We'll definitely look at that. I know there's a discussion too about maybe using some of the Tech Talks to talk more about release type of work as opposed to getting into some of the details of individual services at that point. We'll certainly have that as a consideration point. With that, I am going to open up for any questions you may have. Again, it might be about the logging service, but it could be about anything else with regard to EdgeX. Anything is fair game. And please remember, folks, that I think by default, Brett has you on mute, so you'll have to unmute yourself if you have a question. Or if you prefer, you can send a chat message. And while I'm waiting for the first question to come in, let me see if there are any chats right now. Nope, don't have any at this second. Questions, comments, concerns? A lively group ready to get off to Thursday night football, it sounds. Alrighty, folks. If there aren't any questions, again, feel free. Even if you have a question and it doesn't come to you until a little bit later, you can obviously send me an email, but you can also post a question into Rocket Chat as well. We have a Project Rocket Chat site that you can get access to through edgexfoundry.org. Get yourself signed up, and we'll be answering questions that way too. One last call. Otherwise, Brett, I think we'll be ready to wrap it up.
All right. Thanks
Very good.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good one. We'll talk to you soon.